learn about the structure of the synapse. But before we understand the structure of the synapse, we first need to know this about the neuron, which is essentially the nerve cell. So how many nerve cells do you have in a human? You have about 86 billion. So everyone here is a billionaire, but right. Now, a neuron is made up of three important parts. First is the cell body or the soma, where the nucleus is placed. At the cell body or the soma, the neuron have this small projection around it, which is known as the dendrites. One of the projection is longer compared to others, and this is known as the axon. And this axon will then branches off to form all these smaller parts, which is known as the terminal axon or the nerve ending. Now let's have a look at the axon. The axon is the longest projection projecting from the cell body, and this axon, it has this special structure known as the myelin sheath, and this myelin sheath is produced by a special cell known as the Schwann cells. Think about this myelin sheath as a covering of the axon. However, it does not continuously cover the axon, but rather it leaves some spaces in between the sheath. And these spaces, uncovered or exposed space of the axon, is known as the nodes of Ranvier. Now, this nodes of Ranvier is very important because it speeds up the impulse transmission down the axon. If you think about the action potential, how does the action potential is generated? Okay, it first need to cause depolarization of the part of the axon, and when it hits the threshold of about negative 55, then it will cause action potential to fire, and this depolarization needs to travel across the axon, and the action potential can travel across the axon, and you can imagine that it needs some time to do so. Therefore, with the nodes of Ranvier and the myelin sheath in place, the action potential transmission can be sped up, because the action potential, rather than having to go through all along, it would rather jump at the nodes of Ranvier. Therefore, it allows for faster impulse transmission. So what is a synapse? Okay, so if you think about how the neurons communicate with each other, how do they pass on the transmission? So imagine this is one synapse, and then there is the second synapse. So the point at which the first and the second synapse is getting together is known as a synapse, which is the junction between the two neurons. The first neuron is what we call as the presynaptic neuron, whereas the second neuron here is the postsynaptic neuron. If we go on to zoom in at what happened at the point of communication between these two, you can see the structure of the synapse. So there are three important structures. The first one is the synaptic end bulb of the presynaptic neuron. So this is actually the ending of the terminal axon. Number two, there is the space, very narrow space between the two neurons known as the synaptic cleft. And finally, you have the postsynaptic neuron or the postsynaptic membrane. Now, on the presynaptic neuron at the synaptic end bulb, there is a lot of mitochondria, which helps to generate energy in form of ATP, because there's a lot of process going on in the synaptic end bulb. For example, the synthesis of the neurotransmitter, the release of the neurotransmitter, and so on. There's also these bubbles of air known as the synaptic vesicles, and these synaptic vesicles contain the neurotransmitter, which acts like a postman between the two neurons. On the postsynaptic neuron, there is this specialized protein which acts as a receptionist to receive the information from the presynaptic neuron, and these are known as the receptors. How many neurons are needed to form a synapse? Of course, there's two, the presynaptic neuron and the postsynaptic neuron. But how many synapses can one neuron form? So the neuron can have more than one synapses depending on the arrangement. So we talk about the synaptic arrangement, there are several classifications, but we're going to have a look at first by the numbers of the pre and the postsynaptic neuron. The one that we talked earlier is what we call as the one-to-one arrangement, one presynaptic to one post. There's also one presynaptic neuron which synapse with many postsynaptic neurons. This is called as one-to-many, and this is not very common in the central nervous system, in our nervous system. The more common one is actually the many-to-one, meaning that one neuron will receive from more than one presynaptic neurons, and in this case there is a process that will take place known as the integration of information. Think about yourself listening to lectures from me, from Dr. Maizura, from Dr. Roslina, from Dr. Zunaria, and you as the end receiver will have to integrate all this new information to synthesize your own and to come up with your own comprehension. Another way to classify the synaptic arrangement is by the structure. The one that I mentioned before, in which the dendrites synapse with the synaptic and bulb synapse with the dendrite is what we call as the exodendritic. Okay, the axon here referring to the terminal axon. But sometimes the dendrites can also, the axon terminal can also synapse directly with the cell body, known as the exosomatic, or the axon of the postsynaptic neuron, known as the exoaxonal. What are the functions of the synapse? So we know at this point that the synapse actually allows communication between the neurons because it allows the transmission of nerve impulse, which actually contain the information from one neuron to another. But it does not just do the passive thing of transmission, just trying to carry down the message, but it can also has much a bigger role than that, in which it can influence the activity of the other neurons. Okay, for example, there is integration going on. It can also inhibit the other neuron, and depending on the amount of information or the amount of action potential going on, there are several phenomena that can occur. For example, facilitation, potentiation, and also synaptic fatigue.